Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, On the Question of Dialectics. Footnote. The fragment on the question of dialectics is contained in a notebook between the conspectus of Lassalle's book on Heraclitus and the conspectus of Aristotle's Metaphysics, written in 1915 in Bern. End of footnote. The splitting of a single whole and the cognition of its contradictory parts. See the quotation from Philo on Heraclitus at the beginning of section 3 on cognition in Lassalle's book on Heraclitus, is the essence, one of the quote-unquote essentials, one of the principal, if not the principal, characteristic or features of dialectics. Footnote. Lassalle's book on Heraclitus. See page 348 of this volume. End of footnote. That is precisely how Hegel, too, puts the matter. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, continually grapples with it and combats Heraclitus and Heraclitean ideas. The correctness of this aspect of the content of dialectics must be tested by the history of science. This aspect of dialectics, for example in Plekhanov, usually receives inadequate attention. The identity of opposites is taken as the sum total of examples. In parentheses, quote-unquote, for example, a seed, quote-unquote, for example, primitive communism. The same is true of Engels, but it is, quote, in the interest of popularization, unquote, and not as a law of cognition and as a law of the objective world. In mathematics, plus and minus, differential and integral. In mechanics, action and reaction. In physics, positive and negative electricity. In chemistry, the combination and dissociation of atoms. In social sciences, the class struggle. The identity of opposites, it would be more correct, perhaps, to say their quote-unquote unity, although the difference between the terms identity and unity is not particularly important here. In a certain sense, both are correct, is the recognition, discovery of the contradictory, mutually exclusive, opposite tendencies in all phenomena and processes of nature, including mind and society. The condition for the knowledge of all the processes of the world in their quote-unquote self-movement, in their spontaneous development, in their real life, is the knowledge of them as a unity of opposites. Development is the quote-unquote struggle of opposites. The two basic, or two possible, or two historically observable conceptions of development, evolution, are development as decrease and increase, as repetition, and development as a unity of opposites, the division of a unity into mutually exclusive opposites and their reciprocal relation. In the first conception of motion, self-movement, its driving force, its source, its motive, remains in the shade, or this source is made external, God, subject, etc. In the second conception, the chief attention is directed precisely to knowledge of the source of quote-unquote self-movement. The first conception is lifeless, pale and dry. The second is living. The second alone furnishes the key to the quote-unquote self-movement of everything existing. It alone furnishes the key to quote-unquote leaps, to the quote break in continuity, unquote, to the quote transformation into the opposite, unquote, to the destruction of the old and the emergence of the new. The unity, coincidence, identity, equal action of opposites is conditional, temporary, transitory, relative. The struggle of mutually exclusive opposites is absolute, just as development and motion are absolute. Nota bene, the distinction between subjectivism, skepticism, sophistry, etc., and dialectics, incidentally, is that in objective dialectics, the difference between the relative and the absolute is itself relative. For objective dialectics, there is an absolute within the relative. For subjectivism and sophistry, the relative is only relative and excludes the absolute. In his Capital, Marx first analyzes the simplest, most ordinary and fundamental, most common and everyday relation of bourgeois commodity society, a relation encountered billions of times, viz., the exchange of commodities. In this very simple phenomena, in this quote-unquote cell of bourgeois society, Analysis reveals all the contradictions, or the germs of all contradictions, of modern society. The subsequent exposition shows us the development, both growth and movement, of these contradictions and of this society in the sum of its individual parts, from its beginning to its end. Such must also be the method of exposition, that is, study, of dialectics in general, for with Marx, the dialectics of bourgeois society is only a particular case of dialectics. To begin with what is the simplest, most ordinary, common, etc., with any proposition, the leaves of a tree are green, John is a man, Fido is a dog, etc. Here already we have dialectics, as Hegel's genius recognized. The individual is the universal. See Aristotle's Metaphysique, translation by Schechler, Volume 2, page 40, 3, Book 4, chapters 8 to 9. Quote, Denn natürlich kann man nicht der Meinung sein, dass es ein Haus, in parentheses, a house in general, gebe außer den sichtbaren Häusern, unquote. Editor's note. For of course, one cannot hold the opinion that there can be a house in general, apart from visible houses. End of editor's note. Consequently, the opposites, the individual is opposed to the universal, are identical. The individual exists only in the connection that leads to the universal. The universal exists only in the individual and through the individual. Every individual is, in one way or another, a universal. Every universal is a fragment or an aspect or the essence of an individual. Every universal only approximately embraces all the individual objects. Every individual enters incompletely into the universal, etc., etc. Every individual is connected by thousands of transitions with other kinds of individuals, things, phenomena, processes, etc. Here already we have the elements, the germs, the concepts of necessity, of objective connection in nature, etc. Here already we have the contingent and the necessary, the phenomenon and the essence, for when we say, John is a man, Fido is a dog, this is a leaf of a tree, etc., we disregard a number of attributes as contingent, we separate the essence from the appearance, and counterpose the one to the other. Thus, in any proposition we can and must disclose as in a quote-unquote nucleus, quote-unquote cell, the germs of all the elements of dialectics, and thereby show that dialectics is a property of all human knowledge in general. And natural science shows us, and here again it must be demonstrated in any simple instance, objective nature with the same qualities, the transformation of the individual into the universal, of the contingent into the necessary, transitions, modulations, and the reciprocal connection of opposites. Dialectics is the theory of knowledge, of Hegel and Marxism. This is the quote-unquote aspect of the matter. It is not an quote-unquote aspect, but the essence of the matter, to which Plekhanov, not to speak of other Marxists, paid no attention. Knowledge is represented in the form of a series of circles, both by Hegel, see Logic, and the modern quote-unquote epistemologists of natural science. The eclectic and foe of Hegelianism, which he did not understand, Paul Volkmann, see his Erkenntnistheoretische Grundzüge. Footnote: P. Volkmann, Erkenntnistheoretische Grundzüge der Naturwissenschaften, Leipzig, Berlin, 1910, page 35. End of footnote. Quote-unquote circles, in philosophy. Is a chronology of persons essential? No. Ancient. From Democritus to Plato and the Dialectics of Heraclitus. Renaissance. Descartes versus Gassendi, in parentheses, Spinoza, ? Modern. Holbach to Hegel, via Berkeley, Hume, Kant. Hegel to Feuerbach to Marx. Dialectics as living, many-sided knowledge, with the number of sides eternally increasing, with an infinite number of shades of every approach and approximation to reality, with a philosophical system growing into a whole out of each shade. Here we have an immeasurably rich content, as compared with quote-unquote metaphysical materialism, the fundamental misfortune of which is its inability to apply dialectics to the builder theory. Editor's note, the theory of reflection, end of editor's note. To the process and development of knowledge. Philosophical idealism is only nonsense from the standpoint of crude, simple, metaphysical materialism. From the standpoint of dialectical materialism, on the other hand, philosophical idealism is a one-sided, exaggerated, überschwängliches, in parentheses, Dietsken, development, inflation, distension of one of the features, aspects, facets of knowledge, into an absolute, divorced from matter, from nature, apotheoside. Footnote: the reference to the use by Joseph Dietsken of the term überschwänglich, which means exaggerated, excessive, infinite, for example in the book Kleinere philosophische Schriften, Minor Philosophical Writings, Stuttgart, 1903, page 204. Dietsken uses the term as follows, quote, absolute and relative are not infinitely separated, unquote. End of footnote. Idealism is clerical obscurantism. True, but philosophical idealism, quote-unquote more correctly, and, quote-unquote in addition, a road to clerical obscurantism through one of the shades of the infinitely complex knowledge, in parentheses dialectical, of man. Lenin's note in the margin. Nota bene this aphorism. Human knowledge is not, or does not follow, a straight line, but a curve, which endlessly approximates a series of circles, a spiral. Any fragment, segment, section of this curve can be transformed one-sidedly, into an independent, complete straight line, which then, if one does not see the wood for the trees, leads into the quagmire, into clerical obscurantism, where it is anchored by the class interests of the ruling class. Rectilinearity and one-sidedness, woodenness and petrification, subjectivism and subjective blindness. Voila, the epistemological roots of idealism. And clerical obscurantism, philosophical idealism, of course, has epistemological roots. It is not groundless. It is a sterile flower, undoubtedly, but a sterile flower that grows on the living tree of living, fertile, genuine, powerful, omnipotent, objective, absolute human knowledge.